can you?
Okay, we're live. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the August 10th, 2020 study session of the University City Council to order at 5:30 p.m. To all the folks, thank you for joining us. To all of my colleagues, please, if you will continue to mute your computers when you are not speaking, that will be helpful. I know we have guests this evening from MSW, so I will turn the agenda over to Mr. Rose.
Honorable Mayor and council members, back in 2019, we asked MSW to do an analysis of the rates for the solid waste operation. And that was to ensure that our rates are actually keeping current with the services that are provided. And so tonight, we'll turn the meeting over to the representatives. John, I think, is going to be doing the most of the talking, but also Cynthia will be participating in highlighting the findings from that study, as well as what their recommendations are. And Sinan, do you have any comments to make on this?
No, Mr. Rose, just that, like you described, this was a fiscal year 2019 work plan project. And then the report was put together about a year ago. And so there may be some outdated information, but MSW has brought that to our attention as well. And they're ready to update that information as necessary.
Thank you. So I will turn things over to John.
Very well, thank you. And I just making sure I have this squared away. I understand that I will be able to share my screen. Is that the expectation? I just want to confirm that.
Yes.
Very well. So if that is the case, let me get set up and make sure it is coming through. And then I appreciate the chance to talk through the work that we've done and share where we ended up. So let's do screen 2, and let me also put it into PowerPoint mode. And let me ask, can folks now see, yes. Are you seeing a full screen now?
Close enough to a full screen, yeah. Easily viewable.
Super. Super. Very well. Well, I understand I may have 15 or 20 minutes, and I'm a big believer in being respectful of everybody's time, but thank you for the chance to give a briefing here. Sinan, I appreciate the history as well. You never quite expect the way things were going to turn out this year. So I know we've been delayed unexpectedly a few times, but that said, I feel, just given the input and the collaboration that we had with city staff on this project, I feel good about where we are and happy to have a chance to share with you today. Just very briefly, MSW Consultants, we are a management consulting company. We're non-engineering. And management consulting means we help our local government, our city and county clients, state agencies, solid waste authorities, basically do right by their waste management programs, whether it be procurement, whether it be cost and rate analysis, whether we do long-term master planning. But this is definitely our business. Our line of business working with local government spans our entire history. And we really appreciated the chance to have an opportunity to serve the city on this role. And I think a quick bit of history, every time we start a new engagement for a city, there's always that initial assessment. And one thing I can say that was really a pleasant start is that University City had you have a very rational rate structure. So honestly, starting from a position of being in pretty good shape in terms of having rates aligned with services. However, at the time of the engagement, the city had not gone through a formal study. And of course, prior here to this year with the COVID-19 issue, there were some essentially global macroeconomic issues that have significantly impacted the recycling markets that had started to put some real downward pressure on revenues and increased costs for the city. So it just was a good time to undertake more of a formal process. MSW Consultants applies essentially a utility rate setting protocol to your solid waste system. And so we were retained to come in and go through that process with the idea of, hey, at the end of the day, solid waste and recycling, it's a critical service. It's got to be provided. You need a clean and beautiful city. And just like any other utility, our philosophy is it's appropriate for that service and system to have sufficient revenue to be long-term sustainable so you can continue serving your customers, with this important service. I do have a couple of background things to say, and this slide highlights what I just alluded to briefly about changes to the global recycling market. Up until about 2015 or 16, recyclables were, if you delivered recyclables to a recycler, you would make money because they would pay you for the value of the recyclables. But 2017, 2018 hit, and essentially the global export market dried up with a stroke of a pen of the Chinese government. And honestly, the U.S. recycling industry has been struggling to recover ever since. University City, like frankly, most if not all of our clients, and frankly, like most if not all cities and counties across the country that have recycling programs, suddenly saw what used to be either maybe a slight revenue turn into a significant cost. And so this graph really shows that. I don't have a graph for you, but I also would mention that landfill tipping fees also have increased over this time. So essentially the disposal and processing market, those prices have really started to creep up regardless of the outcome of the material. And certainly that was a significant driver of needing to really get a sense of, where does the city stand now, and what's the prospects for continuing to provide services in a financially sustainable manner. I've got a few background slides just to touch base real quick. Our methodology, I won't read the bullets to you, but our philosophy on doing these studies is that not only do we need to invest enough time to compile the financial and the operating data that city staff can provide. By the way, we really appreciate the help. Super responsive. We were able to get the information we needed to build a solid model. But we also are big believers that we have to invest some time to go out on route, to go out at the curb, to be able to observe how the operations work, how the residents set out, what resident expectations are you facing that frankly is unlike any other utility. The fact that your folks are going every week, to households and taking materials away, we need to make sure we really understand operationally what your residents expect. So we spent some time observing your operations and tuck that in, and frankly use some of the understanding and some of the operational productivity data that we were able to get just to have a great understanding of your system. So I always like to point that out because to us, this isn't just sort of a cookie cutter rate study. It really is something that we've got to integrate your operational and financial details. So that said, another thing that we try to do when we're doing this sort of work is to break down the functions that are performed for residents. So essentially we're breaking down the different collection services, and we break those down by resident types or by customer type. So either residential or commercial. And then within residential and commercial, we also break down, is it trash collection? Is it recycling collection? Is it bulky waste collection? So you'll see this table, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit clunky, but essentially we like to do full costs for individual services because that gives you the best management data you need to really understand what the city is providing. Similarly, University City has a transfer station with a recycling drop-off area. We know it's been closed to commercial traffic of late with the new scale and some access road issues coming in, but certainly that's a cost center that we looked at. And certainly you need to be able to manage and administer this system. You've got to have customer service. You've got to run contracts. You've got to make it work. So we typically look at management and administration costs separately, and then we dovetail those into the full cost. As a final piece of background that I always like to highlight, if you are providing trash and recycling collection and you are running a transfer station, you've got at your facility, you've got capital improvement program needs. You've got to put in a new scale would be the easiest example, but you've got to maintain your tip floor. You've got to maintain your facility structures with capital investment. And if you're in the collection business, you are in the truck purchasing business. And over a 7 to 10 year period, it's very important if you're going to run a successful collection business that you are replacing your vehicles in accordance with the useful life. And so we always look at a 10-year time horizon for both capital improvement program investments as well as vehicle replacement investments. And so this slide just lays that out. And again, it's just critical for us, and we got great support from city staff in assembling this together. So we feel like we got a very full picture of the upcoming capital needs of the program. It's not on here, but that red line suggests that if you levelize those capital investments, it's about $600,000 a year just to replace vehicles and make some capital improvements at your facility. All right, I have a couple of graphs for you. I always hesitate to put a whole lot of numbers and colors in front of folks, but I think for those of you who care to pore over the details, whether on this call or later, I do like to provide that. We also have obviously a report that contains additional information. But our full cost method involves developing what we call a test year. So a test year is where it's a forward-looking view of projected direct operating expense as well as annualized expected capital expenditures for what at the time we did the work in 2019, we were looking ahead to 2020. And so the couple of numbers that I would point out to you that are important on this slide is that essentially the full cost, or rather the rate revenue that you need to keep your system at the break-even point is between 3.4 and 3.5 million. So that's at that bottom table. It's labeled full cost, but essentially that's the rate revenue need, 3,466,000. And so what emerged after accounting for the upward price pressure on recyclables processing and the upward pressure on tip fees, and quite frankly, trucks aren't getting any cheaper, expenses aren't going down, but essentially what we found is that the rate revenue was just over 3 million. And so on a system-wide basis, there's about a 13% deficit from rate revenues to fund the system. And you know what? We've been doing this a long time. I would share that 13.1%, maybe a little higher than you would like, but let me tell you, I think we feel like we were able to catch this where it's not insurmountable. There's some additional data on here. Some of the pie pieces, all of the orange pie pieces correlate to trash collection service. All of the greenish pie pieces translate to yard waste, green waste. Recycling are the blue pie pieces. It's a little bit small, and again, I won't go into detail, but certainly would be happy to take questions as we get to the end of this. But it feels like it would be appropriate to keep going through, and if we need to drill down, we can. Also, I've got another view. And I think this view is actually pretty helpful because it gives you a sense across the different operating lines of business what the relative expense is, if you will, to run that business. So that tall bar on the left, that's essentially what it costs to serve your residential sector. Now, it turns out that's both your single family and your multifamily residential sector. And you can see, based on the relative size of the bars, trash collection and disposal, obviously, the biggest piece. But interestingly, you can see that recycling piece has gotten pretty big as well. Not as many recyclables generated per household, so you don't need quite as many trucks, but still significant. Yard waste, a little bit smaller, and then certainly that bulky waste service, which tends to be a real favorite from residents, is on there as well. Interestingly, on the commercial side, quite a bit smaller footprint on the commercial collection side. And actually, I don't know if you can see my mouse. I'll play around a little bit with it. But on the commercial side, there is both container refuse collection and recycling. We had some very minor other services in terms of container rental and recycling. Almost, I won't say immaterial, but pretty minimal. At your transfer station, at the moment, that facility is a little bit in flux still, but we wanted to split that off. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that having a transfer station, we consider that to be an asset. And so any city that has that facility and has the ability potentially to use that facility in a way to potentially grow revenues, that's an opportunity, having a transfer station when that comes fully up and running. And then last but not least, we obviously were not on site during leaf collection, but that's another critical service that I think residents come to expect on a seasonal basis. So I think this graphic gives that perspective on those different services. And just as a final note here, a couple pictures of the transfer station. It's been closed for a little while now for the scale replacement and road improvements. Some plans to reopen. And again, I think I said my content here on the last slide. At the moment, there are some smaller users at the facility. It's closed to commercial truck traffic, big compactor trucks. But again, that's I would advise you to look at that facility as a resource, as opposed to a potential drain. In this country, if you have the ability to manage your own waste logistics, you can potentially have an advantage going forward. All right, so I have a few rate recommendation slides, and I'll try to break these down because I think they're pretty important. And this is where, as you know, this is where we are going to make recommendations where, depending on your decisions and your thoughts of where we end up, that could be impacting customers. And hey, I know you folks on this this meeting are the ones that are going to hear from customers if they don't like what we're recommending or what goes forward. But we really try to look through the data and balance out where we end up. So I'd like to start with the residential sector, and the residential sector is arguably it's the most important because it's the biggest revenue amount that you're getting, and also it's also the sector that in the U.S. and in Missouri, local governments typically are responsible for handling waste management of the residential sector. Honestly, commercial sector, a lot of different ways to do that, including leaving it to the private market entirely, but the residential sector tends to fall on the shoulders of our local governments. So what's interesting is single family is generally looking pretty good. Curbside service rates for refuse and recycling combined look pretty good. The yard waste sticker program a little bit at a deficit, so some adjustments there. There is some drop-off recycling at the transfer station, which we just recovered under the residential rate. But the key number that, as we kind of looked at, there's always a balance when you're adjusting rates. Obviously you want to make enough revenue to cover your costs, but you also don't want to shock your customers any more than you have to. And I'm sure you all know that better than anybody. But where we have ended up in terms of a recommendation has to do with a fairly noteworthy 6.5% increase in year one. And the following slide, which I'll get to, actually have a path I'll show you. But that 6.5 number is key. And the second bullet under single family about a CPI escalation, that's a consumer price index escalation. Many communities, rather than trying to do rate studies and pass rate changes in a formal setting every year, essentially establish sort of an autopilot ability to increase rates based on some sort of published CPI factor. And MSW Consultants tends to be in favor of that type of program simply because the expenses of running your curbside collection programs and maintaining your facilities and candidly probably paying your staff and employees are going to continue to creep up. And so that CPI adjustment concept builds in, we think, a reasonable amount of just system maintenance, cost increase over time. So that covers the single family. Now, conversely, multifamily is an interesting animal just because of the range of services, both dumpster and some carted service, alley service. It's a lot more varied in terms of how vehicles are making those collections. Also, whereas the single family system is entirely once weekly frequency, there are some multifamily locations that are getting twice a week collection. So, if you think about that, going somewhere twice a week is more expensive than going somewhere once a week. So what we found is that the cost for single family and multifamily on a per unit basis are fairly comparable, but that means we found a bigger deficit on the multifamily side. So the deficit of 30%, that would qualify to us as too big of a rate increase to recommend right up front. That's going to raise a lot of eyebrows. So where this information leaves us is, in order to try to get where we think you want to be, is we've tried to, as this table shows, we've tried to go ahead and take a fairly good bite out of that single family amount in year one, and then transition pretty quickly to this notion of a CPI increase, which we plugged in 2% even on that. On the multifamily side, as you can see, we've taken some bigger increases for the first several years before transitioning into that that CPI increase. And believe me, we don't take lightly that, you start seeing a rate increase over 10%, and that can be a concern. So we get that, but we also think if that multifamily sector, is to be served and receives a level of service that is required in order to do it, that it is reasonable to have those rates go up. And essentially, you'll be coming closer to equilibrating your residential rates in some regard in making these changes. So we don't think there's we don't think there's any inequality being introduced in making these recommendations. In fact, we think, this is at least reasonable. Certainly, you would have opportunities to accept or modify or otherwise change what's here. But we feel like our role as your advisor is to try to come up with a reasonable path forward that we feel would be, responsible and certainly a good starting point for discussion. Let me shift over now to commercial considerations. Commercial is a little bit different animal because it is a much smaller customer base. Some really interesting things emerged. And before I go into the rate recommendations, I should point out that, you go back 5, 6, 7 years, quite a number of cities that provided commercial refuse collection service 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, maybe longer, realized that they could put some cardboard boxes, some recycling containers out, and start encouraging the business community in certain areas to recycle, and that would be something that they could do for free, and it sort of followed up with their objectives. And back when those programs started up, the economics were a little bit more favorable. MSW Consultants believes that it is very difficult to offer a free commercial recycling service with a small commercial customer base. And with only 47 commercial accounts, at the moment, University City is providing recycling for free. Moving away from that, we think, is the way to go if University City stays in the business of serving its commercial customers. And so if I look under options, we actually think there are 2 things you could think about. If University City continues providing that service, we think a way to establish recycling rates and make the commercial service sustainable is to increase the trash collection rates in the range of 10%, and then set recycling rates at a fraction of that. So that would be a rate-related option, a revenue-generating option for the commercial collection services. Honestly, we feel like we at least mentioned another option would be essentially to not be serving the commercial sector. That is, not. I don't know that we're necessarily saying go one way or another, but we feel like we should point out that those are both options that could be taken. Again, our role is to identify a rate path that lets you provide services your customers are expecting. We did have some other things that I think I've touched on, and I'll just leave you with a final list of recommendations. I feel like I probably overshot my time as well, so let me try to get to the end here. Certainly reopening the transfer station and recognizing that as an asset, possibly as a way to increase revenues over the longer term, something to think of. So right now, roll-off service, I probably should have put a picture in here that showed the roll-off service. Right now, the city has a roll-off truck, which is the truck that goes around and pulls those great big boxes you see at construction sites. That vehicle is another revenue-generating opportunity because anybody who's got a construction site or a renovation project or a demolition site, they need somebody to spot a roll-off box and go pull that waste and take it somewhere. And there's no reason University City could not get into and offer that business at a rate that would generate some incremental revenue over and above the cost of that service. So just something to think about. And again, we look at the ability to provide all these collection services as, frankly, greater opportunity to generate revenue for the betterment of the city. And the last 3 bullets, I think, pretty straightforward. At the moment, we mentioned the CPI increase as being a practice that has been successful in other communities. We just want to point out that there would need to be an ordinance revision to do that in University City. Just some background just to make sure that that's an acceptable policy that could be implemented. And you know what, our rule of thumb on doing this type of financial analysis, It's prudent, and we know that your staff will do this anyway, that on an annual basis, essentially just reviewing the projections of our rate analysis, confirming that revenues and expenses are falling within the tolerances that we expected, that the rate model is performing fine. And we generally recommend revisiting about every 5 years, doing kind of a full-blown comprehensive type study, simply because in 5 years, new capital improvements have come up. Your vehicle fleet, sometimes the maintenance, sometimes the replacement can fall off. And who knows, as we've learned this year in 2020, who knows what unforeseen local, regional, national, or global event is going to kick in. And I'm sure University City, like so many of our clients, are feeling those effects. So just some rules of thumb. And with that, I've spoken enough. I'm going to step back a bit and just be here to drill down as needed and answer any questions folks might have. I would also invite Sinan or anyone else, if I have, I've been doing this long enough to know, I like to think I know what I'm talking about, but if I forgot something important, I would obviously encourage city staff or my teammate, Cynthia Mormile, to mention that. But thank you so much for your attention, and would be happy to dig into this a little bit more.
Thank you very much for your presentation, John. I cannot see the participants at the current time to see who has questions of you, so we may need to move away from the split screen for just a little while. And thank you. And we may need to go back. We may need to go back at times to answer questions. We typically go through John and Cynthia, to where each of the council members, if they have questions, usually takes one bite of the apple, and then after everyone else is done, then if we need to go back for a second bite, they can. I noticed that I think Mr. Cusick had his finger up for just a second. So Mr. Cusick, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. John, thank you for the presentation. It's very eye-opening. If the transfer station is reopened and up and running, what will that do in terms of a revenue stream? And would it affect our bottom line in any way? Finances are we talking about, or revenues that we will be talking about? Do you have any idea?
So that's a great question. It's a little bit of something that you would grow into, because some of the cost of that facility, certainly the cost to transport and dispose. In other words, once you load it on a trailer and then you have to drive it somewhere, that's essentially a fixed cost per ton. So whether you take 1 trip or 10 trips, your fee at the transfer station would need to cover that transportation component. And then once it gets to the end point where you're paying a landfill for disposal, that's also a fixed cost. So the objective and the opportunity at that transfer station is, recognizing that you may have some geographic preference, that it's easier for haulers in their commercial collection trucks, which are very, very expensive to operate and only hold about 10, 11, or 12 tons. The opportunity is set a tip fee at your transfer station where you're making, $4, $5, $6 a ton, whatever it is. And then you're consolidating that material into a much lower transportation form, which is a transfer trailer with a tractor, and essentially capitalizing on that more efficient transportation. Now, we did look at roughly what that tip fee might be. And I'm going to ask my colleague Cynthia if she can chime in, because my recollection is we're in the 60 per ton range, if I'm remembering correctly. But Cynthia, either by nod of the head or if you are able to come off mute, if you know that, that would be fantastic.
Yes, I think between what the current landfill rate was when we were looking at it, and we were recommending maybe $68 or so was put into the model that would help. So any increased tonnage that could be managed through there, which would be quite a bit for your facility, would benefit the overall revenue of the utility.
Yeah, and Mr. Cusick, there's a little bit of there's some market dynamics that would go into that longer term. I think the objective would be set your tip fee where you're not going to lose anything. You're going to make a little bit, and then gauge the demand at that point, and then you have some ability to adjust your tip fee up or down depending on whether you get a flood of deliveries or not. And candidly, there are many dynamics in the waste industry that don't necessarily follow perfect microeconomic theory. You could have a large hauler that under some circumstances might have a better economic picture going to your facility, but they want to quote unquote internalize the waste, so they'll never come to your facility because they'd rather run it through their own facilities and keep it all on their books, even if it charges their customers a little more. So there are some dynamics that were outside of the scope and our ability to look at. But I think at that high 60 a ton range, there's at least some incremental revenue likelihood from that. You're not going to get hurt with that, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor, did you want to chime in?
Honorable Mayor, yes, I just wanted to comment to Councilmember Cusick's question. If you recall, there is no recommendation in this fiscal year's budget for a rate increase. We are hopeful that the mayor and council will allow us this time to ensure that we are maximizing our revenues. They've identified the transfer station. That's one that I've asked Mr. Appleson to focus on to ensure that we get contracts with those outside agencies that are using it, as well as can we market it? Is there another market for it as well? So we want to use this fiscal year to make sure that we are maximizing the revenues there. Once we are comfortable that we are maximizing our revenues, that's when we'll come back to you with options. Certainly the fact that the recycling costs that we've started to incur was a surprise, but that surprise occurred roughly 18 months ago. And if you recall, in last fiscal year's budget, as well as in this fiscal year's budget, I recommended simply the solid waste fund absorbing those costs for a period of time. Can't do it forever because the impact is that we're not replacing our equipment in the time period that we should, but we can do it for a little while.
Mayor, I think the next one was, I think Stacy. Who else said? Who said? Mayor?
I think it was. I know Councilman Hales had his hand up. I think before
Jeffrey,
me.
Mr. Hales.
Thank you, and thank you, Councilmember Clay. So I just wanted to, I've got a lot of notes from this, and I appreciate the report, but I did want to just jump back to the roll-off issue, because I've done a lot of rehab in U City, and it was not until fairly recently that I found out that we actually provide that service. And I think it's a 40-yard dumpster. I don't know if there are other sizes available. But I do think that's like an incredible opportunity with all of the people that are coming into community development, contractors, that are having houses all over the city. I've since then I've suggested people, call and inquire about the rates. But I think that's a huge opportunity, especially when you have these contractors coming in. And I don't know precisely. I think I've got a pretty good idea what the fee structure is for permits. Uh-oh, my internet connection is unstable. Do you all hear me?
You're good.
All good.
But that's the kind of thing that I think could be, frankly, marketed.
So, Councilmember Hill, I'm so glad you said that, because it lets me tell a quick but very illuminating story about a long ago client who also had acquired the roll-off equipment that they were using just for their own purposes on several sites. And this was actually a fairly sizable city, actually here in the Florida market. And they realized that they already had the trucks, they already had the containers, and they already had the equipment operators who knew how to provide roll-off collection service. So they decided that they would put it on their webpage as a service that they offered. They did a little financial analysis to confirm a rate that they knew they would make money with every single box they spotted. And they didn't advertise. They didn't put up, splashy billboards. And there's I think 9 other haulers in the market. And after 6 months, just because so many people, the first person they call for refuse collection, refuse removal, waste removal, it's the city. After 6 months, they were, I believe, the top 4 out of the 9 haulers in the region providing that service. And it's all coming, not all, but certainly the revenue that you earn out of that's coming to the bottom line. So I think that's an astute observation. Our philosophy is, hey, if you can make money providing these critical services and beautify your city in the process, and it's a fair and level playing field. In other words, you're not subsidizing that rate somehow, as long as you've got a rational basis for that rate within the market. That, again, it's something that I would agree the city could look at.
I know that we lost Mr. Hales right now, just so I think everyone knows the majority of us are in University City and we are going through a storm. So if we drop off, we will do our best to reboot as the storm allows. I know that Mr. Hales had a question. Let's move on to Mr. Clay.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. Had a couple of questions about the presentation itself. Management and administration, and forgive me if this is articulated somewhere, that includes exactly what?
Yeah, good question. So that would include either some or fractional time of all the staff that are not actually at a facility making the facility operate or on a collection truck driving routes in the city. And so I unfortunately, it's been long enough, I don't have the details on recall. But those are going to be your customer service folks. It's going to be seen on some of his staff. I would ask Cynthia if you recall any specific details that would be worthwhile. But it would be both the individuals who are not directly running a facility or directly performing collection, as well as pickup trucks, equipment, whatever is needed by that group of folks in order to make the system run. And I think what I would say is, we could debate what's the right percentage of management and admin costs. We see a range, and I would tell you that University City probably is within the range that we would expect of a local government provider of those services. I don't know that I can say there's a hard and fast rule of thumb, but we didn't see that University was way outside any tolerance on that. So, and I'll stop there because Cynthia may have some additional details to your direct point of what's included in that, which is a totally fair question.
Just some overhead, sort of things like auditing and accounting, collection fees, professional services, insurance, things of that.
Yeah, actually, and I'm glad you said that because a lot of times other departments of the city need to essentially charge the Public Works or Solid Waste Department to provide, IT, risk management, insurance. So I think that tends to be kind of those allocated overhead expenses as well, which sometimes are out of the control of the actual operating group. And I think, Cynthia, correct me if I'm wrong, we have a very detailed model. And if anybody, I would make this offer to anybody on this meeting. If anybody's interested in really drilling down and seeing the individual line items and how they got allocated, we're big believers in being transparent on that. And so we've got a model that shows the basis of these cost workups.
And that was actually kind of part two of my question, because I'm certainly glad to hear the city manager articulate that which we knew, that we were holding the line on fees this fiscal year. But if we are contemplating raising rates at some point, and I understand the response to our increased recycling charges, I think the questions our citizens ask, I think the question we would all ask is, what are we doing as an administration to hold down costs? I understand we're exploring new revenue options, but what are we also doing on the expense side to make sure that we are providing the most efficient service we possibly can? I understand we may be relatively lean now, but are there ways we can not necessarily be leaner, but work a bit more efficiently to also reduce cost? So that I'm glad to hear that if I'm understanding correctly, we're not really out of line from a management and administration perspective. The second thing relates to the transfer station, in that it's my understanding that, and I, full disclosure, had a conversation with former city councilman Byron Price. This is something that came up during the time Mayor Crow and others may remember Evelyn Shields had actually done a report looking at possibilities related to the transfer station as a revenue generator. And so this conversation has been out there for a while. So I'm hopeful that this will really come to fruition now, and we can really see some benefit from that asset as you articulated it.
Is that a question or is that a comment?
That's a comment. That's a comment.
Okay, we've got three people who have questions to ask. So we've got a little bit of limit. So if we can be tight on questions and tight on answers, that would be great. Councilmember Smotherson.
Well, I'll be very quick and just thank you for the report. And I just wanted to say how efficient, this is my question, how efficient is dumpsters versus individual carts? Is there anything in your report that actually states that specifically because of, and I would actually say lost revenues in certain areas? Not everybody is being accountable because they're using the dumpsters and not paying the fees. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good question. I'll answer very concisely about the efficiency. The bigger the container, the more efficient and the lower cost per unit it is to run. So a dumpster collection service strictly on a per unit basis with all else being equal. In other words, everybody has once a week. It's, running that fork truck to lift a dumpster that have, for instance, 6 or 7 homes or 8 homes using it is more efficient. The challenge in the multifamily sector, however, is that you're still doing some recycling. There still could be bulky material. There still could be green waste. There still could be services outside of those dumpsters. And there also is, I hope I'm not mixing this up. I believe you also have some alley collection issues. So there's some point of service differences. And I think our philosophy on looking at single family and multifamily is to take those differences into account, to take the fact that there could be a blend of collection vehicles that might be serving that multifamily sector, but from an ease of administration and from a level of reasonableness, coming up with with rates that that cover that sector, even if they're not perfectly at cost. We think that is a reasonable practice. So let me stop there because there may have been some more things you were looking for in that question.
Well, and that's fine, and that's true because in a lot of places we have dumpsters with single family households, and that's the efficiency I'm really looking at. I definitely understand in multifamily, but we have dumpsters in alleys for single family, and I'm just wondering how efficient that is simply because there are people in those single family households not paying fees.
You know what? Great question. And I think that comes back to our notion that that's why we looked at the residential sector more as a group, because unless the city wants to get into the business of putting fancy RFID tags or other tracking devices, on those dumpsters, which is a huge customer service investment. Let's face it, at the risk of a bad pun, trash collection is messy. Having enough containers spread out so that your residents, whether single family or multifamily, have the capacity to, in a sanitary fashion, get their waste off the curb, and that your collection trucks can do that efficiently. There's going to be some gray areas in there, in terms of frankly, yeah, there probably are some single family folks in dumpsters. There could be some multifamily folks with carts. And so there is a blend. And that's why we really try to do these studies as a full system, because you're going to always have little exceptions. That kind of comes with the territory.
Thank you.
John, thank you. Ms. Klein. And you are muted right now. Yeah.
Okay, my question is about the commercial recycling. And from looking through the report, it looks like there's a significant cost for that commercial recycling that the commercial entities don't pay for. So this seems to be something that you recommended, either not providing that service for them or getting more customers so that we can spread that cost out. What do you think is the better option? Is that a good way to cut costs?
Councilmember Planet, you cut out a little bit, but I think I got it. With regards to the commercial trash and recycling collection, just, a little bit of operations 101, the most significant cost of that service is driving that truck around to go pick up, whether it's trash or recycling. Driving that truck is the most significant component of the cost of collection. It used to be obviously if you take trash for disposal, then you have to pay $1 per ton, some amount per ton to dispose of the trash. You used to be able to take those commercial recyclables somewhere and maybe somebody would pay you $10 a ton. In other words, you make a little money after you invested the cost to go collect it. Well, starting in 2018, now that same truck goes and collects commercial recyclables and incurs all the collection costs. Then it goes to try to deliver those recyclables to a recycling facility, and now it's paying probably more per ton to get rid of the recyclables than the trash. And so, as a practical matter, subsidizing the recycling collection commercial recycling entirely is not practical. And so our recommendation is either increase your commercial dumpster rates and also establish at least some commercial recycling rate so that you're making the full revenue needed to provide those services combined. However, if that doesn't work, maybe commercial businesses all drop recycling and the economics changes. Another option is to leave that service to the private sector to come in and handle. So those are the two options that we just would call out. Honestly, if your customers are happy and they're paying your rates and they're keeping the recycling collection and the city's meeting its environmental goals and making its revenue, that's a pretty easy system to keep, pretty easy service to keep providing.
Okay, I understand that Mr. Mulligan, I believe, who is muted right now, has a question or a comment.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Just to questions and points raised by Council Members Clay and Cusick. Councilmember Cusick asked about the amount of money that the transfer station could yield. In 2005, staff and former city manager Frank Ollendorf and I engaged in extensive negotiations with Fred Weber. Fred Weber appeared before the council on October 10th of 2005 and said the number was $300,000 that it would net the city. It was going to be a public-private partnership where a new transfer station would be built. Councilmember Clay referred to former Public Works Director Evelyn Shields. She was also involved in this, but the council decided not to act on that agreement, and city manager, former city manager Ollendorf retired shortly thereafter. I have a very thick file on that. I'd be happy to share that with the current city manager and staff.
Okay, John, is that all on that one?
That's it.
Thank you. Okay, before we get the second bite, which we're not going to have much time for, I have a couple of questions, and I think this, Gregory, a couple of these may be to you, and then of course, John, some may be to you or to Cynthia, and that is, when is the transfer station? It says 2020. When is it actually up and running?
Mayor, I will defer to Sinan. I know that we have made some investments last fiscal year to get it up and running. So Sinan should be able to give you an estimated time frame.
The transfer station is, it's only serving our internal needs right now. So we can still tip our own loads, trash loads at the transfer station, but we cannot accept others to use it because the transfer station has a new scale installed and the old scale is not in working shape anymore. But we need a new access road for that new scale, truck scale. And that project is in the works to be completed by the end of the calendar year. And that's the expectation about this calendar year, to be able to open the transfer station up to outside use.
So the answer is about December 2020, right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Next question I have is, when was the last increase that we pushed through on single family curbside service? Was it 2 years ago? Was it?
Mr. Rose, I have the answer.
Yes, please.
2016 for 12%.
2016. Okay, thank you. And then on the multifamily that's running at a deficit, that we have the, I'm assuming if I'm a multifamily user and I'm going to get this significant increase, am I just going to try to go private and not use the city, or is that an option?
Honorable Mayor, I defer to John. Do you recall that we restrict for multifamily that they are required?
Well, if there's only a few of them that use it, we must not restrict it. They must go private. But my question is just, if we raise the fees that much, aren't we just going to have them go private?
My recollection is there's a cutoff in terms of the number of housing units per building, number of dwellings per building that establishes the level under which the city essentially collects multifamily. And Cynthia, please, if you're remembering something different, but I think University City, like most cities, defines, I guess I would call it almost like small multifamily. So I don't remember if it's up to 6 units or 8 units or 4 units, but that's the multi-dwelling unit buildings. But then certainly the super high rises are already, served by the commercial sector. And Cynthia, I was hoping that I talked at least briefly, but long enough that you're able to go put your finger on exactly what that household cutoff was. But maybe not.
I don't have it, but it's higher than we usually see. I think it's 5 or less. A lot of times it's 4.
Yeah, Mr. Appleton, do you recall?
Yeah, that's accurate. 5 units or less, because of the characterization of the use as residential. In that case, the 6 units and above become commercial.
I just want to be clear that our current code restricts them. They're required to use city services.
Okay.
So yeah, you don't have that elasticity issue.
Yeah, they're a captive customer.
Okay, I know that I think, do we have other questions? Because what I suggest that we do is allow just a couple of more questions, and we will simply move the naming of streets and parks to the regular agenda. We can just pop it on. I think it was John, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's already on a study session agenda, and we're just going to have that discussion with no action taken during the public portion. I'm assuming that is okay. Is that right, John?
We're going to go. Mulligan.
He's muted, right?
I'm sorry, John Mulligan, but that's okay. So let's keep moving. Mr. Hales, you had a question.
Yes, I apologize. Like power went out and on and you lost me. I hope that what I was getting at was clear, but I think we have a very captive audience in community development that are pulling permits that we could market and sell. That we have the equipment, we have the staff. I think most people, if I didn't know about it, I think most contractors and people who have done home renovations of their own homes probably don't know about that service. So I think there's a lot of opportunity at the window at community development to potentially capture, or at least make people aware. And one of the things that I thought about was, we have to get a permit. Could we wrap the rental into the permit fee? And then the next thing was, we just talked about how much revenue are we not capturing, whether it's the larger multifamily, the Wash U owned properties, what opportunity is there in that realm to, again, because we already have the vehicles that are driving down all of these streets every single week. What opportunity is there there? That's all.
This is John. I'll take a shot at that. And I think the comment that to some degree, because the city already provides dumpster collection to the smaller multifamily units, you have the right equipment to potentially expand that dumpster customer base. To some degree, the same economic thought process holds true, with the one difference being is that if you do expand on the front load side, it's very likely that you might incur the need to purchase new trucks and essentially take on some risk as to whether or not you're able to win market share. I think that the biggest difference is at the moment, the single family and multifamily services you're providing to captive customers. You would be competing in front load, but you possibly might have to make investments that may or may not pay off. And I would differentiate that from the roll-off service, where you already have the trucks and the people to take on more service without either hiring a lot more people or buying more trucks. So there's a little bit more opportunity to generate incremental revenue on the roll-off side. Could you do it front load? Absolutely. It would take, I think, more planning and a little bit more economic analysis and having a business plan to do that. So again, same principles. I think you just go about it a little more cautiously on the front load side.
Okay. Any other questions of John or Cynthia, Gregory or Sinan? Hearing none, what I would suggest that we do is, I know we have to have another Zoom invitation for the regular session. If you don't mind, I would welcome a motion during the regular session just to amend the agenda to move that very brief conversation about street signs to the next agenda, if that's okay with everybody. Is that okay with everybody?
And that's
Second.
permitted, Mayor. That's okay.
You're a little late to the dance on that one, John.
I was muted for some reason, but yes.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second by Mr. Smotherson or Mr. Hales to amend the agenda to move item number 3 from the study session to the public agenda. And we'll simply put it under council business if that's okay with it. I think that's okay with the motion. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. This session, the study session, will be closed. To John and Cynthia, thank you very much for joining us. To everyone else, we'll take just a very, very quick break. Then we'll be back online, hoping that the storm does not knock us out. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye now.